Let's take a look at education as a social institution now. Again, first thing we'll look at is the functionalist perspective. For education, the manifest or primary function of education is socialization. Now, when we say socialization, we're not talking about just teaching kids how to talk to one another, how to socialize. We're talking about basically the transmission of knowledge and skills, teaching kids what they need to know to become a productive member of society. That's what we really mean by socialization. So that is the manifest function. Now, obviously, schools also include a lot of latent or secondary functions, things like teaching values, whether directly or indirectly. Kids learn a network, they develop a social network of friends, they develop communication skills, education promotes social integration, getting people kind of weaved into our culture. One of the secondary functions that I absolutely hate, but it's true, it's a babysitting function. Let's face it, parents know that from 8 o'clock in the morning till 3 o'clock in the afternoon, your school has your child, and it is essentially a babysitting function. So I hate to admit that, but that's the truth. So there are a number of various secondary functions that education plays. Now, if you evaluate education from a conflict perspective, Karl Marx would say that the whole education system is simply an instrument that the elite within society use to further impose their values upon others. Okay. Furthermore, the system's designed to control and keep students in their place. And let's face it, after hundreds and hundreds of years now, okay, blacks and Hispanics are still less likely to complete high school than are whites. Females, when females enter grade school, they are equal or ahead of their male classmates in math and reading, virtually almost in everything. However, after high school, males tend to perform better than females on both math and verbal testing. So, in some way, shape, or form, we are continuing to kind of promote the powerful in culture and kind of ignore the lesser of our students, at least from a conflict perspective. Okay? Now, the other thing that the conflict perspective talks about is the hidden curriculum. And this is kind of the part of the social control that schools promote through many of the things that they use, the techniques and things like that. It refers to the transmission of cultural goals that are not openly acknowledged sometimes. For example, obedience to authority. Okay? Little children are taught to stand in line, to be quiet, to obey. Don't talk until you're called upon. You know, those sorts of things are referred to as the hidden curriculum. Okay? Those things that kind of keep people in their place. And the conflict theorists believe that this is just another way that the powerful use to remain in their advantageous positions of authority. Now, if we talk about traditional American education, we'll talk about traditional, and then we're going to talk about some reforms in education. Traditional American education sounds funny, but we always emphasized the 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic. Those were the basic things that we looked at: reading, writing, and arithmetic. It wasn't until the later 80s and early 90s when we really started kind of expanding the curriculum and putting much more focus on a variety of things in education. Now, let's talk about some of the reforms. And one of the basic reforms that we had coming about in the early 80s, 1983, was A Nation at Risk. Believe it or not, the best SAT scores that this country has ever shown in terms of average SAT scores were actually in the late 1960s. And from that time point on, through the 70s, SAT scores on national average and so forth tended to decline and continued. And finally, in 1983, a national commission under the direction of Terrell Bell, who was Secretary of Education at the time, they got together and they produced a 26-page document. They published this document, and basically they referred to it. It was titled "A Nation at Risk." Now, this committee that developed this, okay, A Nation at Risk, they got a lot of media attention. The report stated that American students were falling behind internationally in math and science and literacy skills, essentially blaming all of society's problems on education. Now, what is kind of interesting is that none of the people on the committee were actually educators. Essentially, all the people that were there were business people, people in their, 40s, 50s, even 60s, who had never been in the schools for years. And so they were going in and trying to figure out, okay, here's what's wrong, and here's what we think we need to do to fix it. Now, some of the criticisms and reforms of A Nation at Risk. Again, they compared U.S. test scores with countries around the world. The problem with that is not all the time do those statistics compare. For example, kids around the globe are not always taking the same test, and the test that they take, even if you take and look at averages, a lot of times the averages depend on how many people are taking the test, what level of student is taking the test. And as an example, in some countries around the world, you got to be in the top 10% of students to even take college entrance exams. In the United States, we have approximately 67% of kids in high school who take college entrance exams, whether or not they're going to college or not. So it's in many ways, sometimes you're comparing, for example, the top 2/3 of people in America versus maybe the top 10% of another country. So statistics can be misleading. That's all I'm trying to make a point of there. Now, some of the reforms that A Nation at Risk emphasized, they said you need to spend more time on task. Schools would have a pep rally. That's not educational. They would have a convocation where they had a speaker come in to talk. That wasn't necessarily teaching math or teaching science. So they wanted more time on task. I remember our school, we had 50-minute class periods. We upped it to 60-minute class periods. They also increased graduation requirements. In 1983, it took 32 credits to graduate from high school in Indiana. By 1990, it then took 38 credits to graduate from high school in Indiana. So more credits. Longer school day and longer school year. They even talked about the concept of required summer school. Now, the issue here, okay, for example, a lot of schools back then were 170 or 175 school days a year. Now we're up to 180. One of the issues here is if I'm a boring teacher and I'm doing a very poor job, if I'm boring your kids for 170 days, I can surely bore them for 10 more days. Just simply adding more time at the end of the day or at the end of the year is not necessarily going to help education. You really have to think about the quality of the education that you're giving kids. So despite these reforms in the next 10 to 15 years after A Nation at Risk, there's very little progress made. SAT scores were not really going up. It was kind of like the United States reaction to the Soviet launching of the satellite Sputnik in 1957. Sputnik galvanized the nation to take quick action using crisis language and things like that, and pushed policymakers to do things. Well, by the same token, this was what was happening in education. However, both political parties tend, not always, but they tend to focus on short-term solutions rather than investing in long-term research that could maybe show exactly what proposed reforms work and which ones don't. Everybody wants their plan to be the biggie, and the thing is, they look at short-term results. Here we are, we're now 3 decades after A Nation at Risk, and for the most part, the goals and things that they set then still have not really come to fruition. However, at least this did get us motivated in terms of ushering in kind of an era of reform. So that was a good thing. Now, let's take a look in the 1990s. We took a little bit of a different approach in terms of reform. A lot of schools started kind of a complete overhaul of their system. Instead of just adding a program here or a program there that tried to do something, they tried to revise the entire way that school was being done. They focused on the curriculum. A lot of schools around the country increased the rigor. They made the classes tougher. They kind of raised the bar, so to speak, telling students you're going to have to do better to be able to pass this course or to be able to graduate from this school. They revised school management, staff development. Staff development was a huge thing. If a teacher didn't really know how to teach, train them. Do something. Do some sort of development so that that teacher who wants to be effective can now find ways to be effective. That helped tremendously. And the whole idea of student assessments, that stuff started all the way back in the 90s. Not to the extent of No Child Left Behind. We'll talk about that later. But the whole idea of student assessment and being able to kind of monitor students, all that stuff started in the mid-90s. Parent involvement, one of the biggest things that basically can help students in terms of their ability to do well in school is getting parents involved. And that was a big initiative in the school reform movement of the 90s. The thing is, all of this that took place, scores started to rise. The studies that were coming out after these studies were very positive. Okay, schools were making progress. And this continued in terms of showing, the SAT scores and all. SAT scores rose almost 20 points or so in a number of about 8 or 9 years throughout the mid-90s to very early 2000s. And that's when we hit the 2001 mark, we get to No Child Left Behind. And we're going to do that one in a different, a separate screencast here.